Daesh on the verge of losing its last holdout. Thousands are forced out as US-backed forces inch closer to retaking the terror group's final town in eastern Syria. We ask what comes next for the fighters, their wives, and their ideology. I'm Imran Garda, and today's newsmaker is the evacuation of Baghouz. Daesh's self-proclaimed caliphate has all but collapsed. Their territory once stretched over nearly a third of Syria and Iraq, but a 4-year international campaign has reduced that to a single village. Now, up to 1,000 of the terror group's remaining militants are believed to be holed up in their last bastion of Baghouz, near Syria's border with Iraq. They are surrounded by the US-backed Syrian Democratic Forces. And as they push in, thousands are fleeing, including many of the foreign militants and their families. The question now facing their home nations is what to do with them. Bring them back to face the music, or wash their hands of them by revoking their citizenship. That debate in a moment. But first, Haider Abbasi takes a look back at how the terror group fell.
Daesh is making its last stand. They're surrounded in this village in eastern Syria. The terrorists say they'll fight to the death. There's not many of them left.
The
number of Daesh terrorists is estimated to be in the hundreds, but the bigger number is the civilians who are still trapped under their grip. So we cannot start any battles, especially with the fear that massacres could take place.
The Syrian Democratic Forces are leading the fight. The SDF is predominantly made up of the YPG terror group. They're getting air support from the United States. The SDF says Daesh are using civilians as human shields and have also built tunnels and laid explosives around the village. Thousands of people have already been evacuated from the area. Daesh militants have been among the civilians who've escaped. They've been arrested and interrogated by the SDF. There are Europeans and Americans that have left too, such as the British national Shamima Begum, who joined Daesh when she was 15 and has since had her citizenship revoked. There's not much left of Daesh's so-called Caliphate. At the peak of its strength in 2015, Daesh controlled vast areas in Syria and Iraq, including Iraq's second largest city, Mosul. At that time, it had around 100,000 fighters. But now, this is all it holds, the village of Baghouz in eastern Syria. Only a few hundred militants remain. Daesh captured territory in Iraq and Syria in a lightning-fast campaign in 2014. Iraq's armed forces largely fled without putting up a fight. At one point, there were fears that Baghdad could be invaded by the militants. The terror network was led by this man, Abu Bakr al-Baghdadi. He proclaimed the areas controlled by Daesh to be a caliphate, with its capital, the city of Raqqa, in northern Syria. The campaign against Daesh began with US-led airstrikes in 2014, and the first major victory took place when the Iraqi city of Ramadi was recaptured a year later. But possibly the biggest blow for Daesh happened in October 2017, when it lost control of Raqqa. After that, its territory in Iraq and Syria began to shrink rapidly. It seems likely it won't be long before Daesh is finally crushed. But will this really be the end of the group's activities in the region? Or could the terror group continue to pose a threat? Haider Abbasi, The Newsmakers.
Let's go to our guest now. Joining me from London is Ajmal Masroor. He's an imam and member of the Muslim Council of Britain. In Washington, D.C., we have Robin Simcox. He's a fellow at the Heritage Foundation, specializing in terrorism and national security. And completing our panel is Matthew Brodsky. He's a Middle East analyst and senior fellow at the Security Studies Group. Gentlemen, thanks so much for joining us here on the Newsmakers. Let me start with you, Robin Simcox. And I think we're going to separate this out. We're going to look at the movement, the ideas and ideology left behind, but also the people left behind and what to do with them. But firstly, looking at the movement, Robin, the fact that these Daesh fighters are holed up in Baghouz, and that's the last remaining stronghold 4 years on, does it tell you that the group is essentially done?
I don't think so. I think it's an encouraging development. Obviously, we needed to go into Syria and Iraq and remove the Caliphate, which was a cause of so much instability and a base for terrorist attacks around the world, as well as a magnet for foreign fighters. And it's a undoubtedly positive development that Caliphate has now been essentially destroyed. But ISIS, we know, will pivot to other regions. It will change its tactics. It will adopt something more of an insurgency approach. And so while we should be encouraged with what has happened so far in this conflict, we should be encouraged that ISIS is on the back foot. What we can't do is let up on the pressure. Otherwise, ISIS will come back, and it will come back strongly.
Matthew Brodsky, claims from the US president and others essentially saying ISIS have been defeated. Is that premature?
Well, if you were to apply that comment to the physical establishment of the Caliphate, a territorial entity in Syria and Iraq, then yes, it has been destroyed. And that's very important because, of course, the actual physical territory creates a far larger draw when trying to bring in recruits and foreign fighters from abroad, obviously. So in that regard, yes. Of course, though, as Robin said, they have spread out. Even their media operations have become a bit more decentralized in the past year, and they will sprout out wherever they can. Specifically in Africa, seems like a welcoming area. It also has resources, which, as we know from northeastern Syria, was a reason that ISIS was drawn there to get oil revenue that it would trade with others. So I think it's a problem for years to come, certainly.
Ajmal Masroor. So, on the ground, they lose their caliphate, or khilafah as they would call it. They don't have Baghdadi's dream. And, you know, a few years ago, people were really scared that they might swallow up more territory, town after town, city after city. But in terms of what's left behind, we saw Al-Qaeda defeated in many places. It only morphed into Daesh, and it splintered and went elsewhere. The bad ideas, Ajmal, are they going to stick around? And how much of a danger are they?
Just to clarify, I'm not from the Muslim Council of Britain, just so that you know. I am an imam in London, and of course I do lots of political broadcasting and commentating. But the question that you've raised, ISIS came about when there was a vacuum created by our government's failure to do something, or international government's failure to do something about the mess that was created, the massacre that was perpetrated by the Syrian administration. And before that, the illegal war waged by George Bush and Blair in destroying, destabilizing Iraq and the region. So that was the vacuum that ISIS came to fill. And they found local support at that time because people of Syria were desperately looking for somebody to save them.
Ajmal, just before you continue, right? Yes. Can we say quite clearly, without any equivocation, that's one side of the coin, and the other side of the coin is a problem within the Muslim community of extremism, that this has been generated from within, and both together created this horrible toxic mix? And is that terrible idea still going to continue?
I can't say that, because Muslim community is not one monolith. We have got different varieties of people coming from different cultural backgrounds. If you were to look at 1.8 billion Muslims of the world, if all Muslims were in sync or in conformity to ISIS ideology, there would be chaos in the world.
I didn't say that.
You just said,
but can we say from within?
Can we say
from within Islamic context and communities?
Let me explain.
In addition to foreign policy, in addition to all of these things mixed together, where we are right now, is that going to continue? The group has been defeated, but all those other issues...
Okay, let me explain.
Okay, go ahead.
Let me explain myself, because the more questions you raise, the more confusing I'll become. So one question at a time is much easier for me to deal with. Muslim community does not support, or sorry, let me rephrase that. Islam does not support extremism, terrorism, or any form of violence and things that we have seen perpetrated in the name of Islam by some people. It is not to say that some Muslims are not rotten. It is not to say some Christians are not behaving badly. And it is not to say that other people of other faith don't behave badly, even though their religions don't support it. So that's number one. Number two, I agree that extremism, unfortunately, has proliferated in Muslim-majority countries in many ways that we don't want to see, and of course causing havoc. But there are underlying reasons for it. Say, for example, Egypt. Egypt, unfortunately, will see proliferation of more extremism the more we turn a blind eye to this monster general, I call him, Sisi, and his very heavy-handed approach. So we need to be consistent. I agree that we should defeat extremism. We should defeat terrorism, and I'm all for it. However, piecemeal approach is not going to deal with it, unfortunately.
Okay. And I want to move this on now because I don't want the entire discussion to be about the roots of extremism and who to blame or what to blame, right? But Robin, as we look at who's left behind, so we're seeing the Caliphate crumbles. Yes, there are couple thousand fighters left behind, but we're also seeing women and children being evacuated and leaving. And it cooks up all sorts of conundrums as to what to do with them because many of them hold Western passports. What do you think needs to be done? If we can separate out the combatants from the non-combatants, should those people be allowed to go back to their home countries and either face justice or rehabilitation, Robin?
Well, this is the major issue that countries are dealing with now. I think in the last couple of weeks, we've seen in the US and the UK examples of women who were drawn to ISIS's caliphate initially, who traveled over there to Syria from the US and the UK, and who are now essentially wanting to come back now that caliphate has been defeated. But my attitude to this is that women should be treated exactly the same as men. It's a fallacy to believe that women were all naive or manipulated or brainwashed any more than it was the case with the men that went to join the caliphate. If there's evidence that can be brought against them, they can be prosecuted in court. If there isn't the evidence, that's where things start to really get tricky, and it's very, very difficult for civilian courts to try some of these people that have been captured abroad, and that's why governments like the UK look into alternatives such as removing the citizenship of dual nationals or those who have another passport they can use in an attempt to prevent them coming back into the country. But it's a very, very thorny and difficult mess to try and wade through.
Matthew Brodsky, hold them to account in front of a court of law and punish them according to your own laws, or if you have the option, just strip them of citizenship so you don't have to deal with it. Which one do you go with?
Well, I think there are several options here. One, this is why Guantanamo Bay was created to begin with after the 9/11 attacks in the United States. Was for foreign fighters, people that we captured in a battlefield in a war, and this still constitutes a war. So it's interesting that now that so many of these fighters come from Western countries, of these some 1,500 fighters that are currently being held in this area in Syria, it's 850 or so, according to U.S. estimates, that are foreign fighters. Suddenly now Europe perhaps is understanding why the U.S. had done this, because this is the reason to be stripping citizenship away, is to essentially say, well, I don't want to deal with it. Let this be your problem. So the your problem way of dealing it is you can have them be tried by the Iraqi governments or the Syrian government. The problem with that, of course, is the U.S. doesn't really work with Assad, nor should it. And of course, Assad was one of the dictators who let these Islamists out of prison to begin with in 2011. There's also the idea of the International Criminal Court and keeping these prisoners kept in the Kurdish areas where they currently are. There are some problems with that as well, but I think those could be addressed. The other issue is, of course, bringing them back to the countries where they're from. This is what President Trump has called for, and there have been various responses from Western European countries. And then lastly is to just release them, which is interestingly would be the equivalent to what Assad has been doing throughout Syria. He would capture or take territories that had ISIS members. He'd put them on buses and, of course, ship them to where the U.S. and SDF was located and still fighting.
Right.
So it would be the reverse process.
Although, Matthew, do you have
to be the options?
Do you have to maybe make a distinction there where, when we look at the timeline with Iraq and Syria specifically, and when Assad initially had released these former extremists or alleged extremists onto the battlefield in Iraq and created trouble across the border, which helped create Daesh, it was quite clear that these people were fighters. Whereas when we're looking at this situation, we're talking about teenage girls and so on, right? So with that in mind, I mean, can we say that somebody could have been innocently caught up in something, especially when they were in close proximity to someone with more power, and they might have been absorbed into a battlefield that they didn't want any part of? What do you do with people such as those, Matthew?
I just think that that's, as Robin points out, a very small number of cases. The fact is, I think these are people that need to be made an example of, and I think the justice should be swift for anyone involved in this. The fact is, if ISIS is going to be drawing recruits now primarily through the internet, people around the world need to know when they look at such garbage on the internet and are thinking about maybe joining this, that it is a dead-end job.
Okay, that's interesting.
Nowhere.
Okay,
and that they
interesting
don't get
point.
to say, whoops.
Right. Yeah, okay. So, Ajmal, I know you've been on the show before to discuss, the Shamima Begum story as well. And moving this forward to talk about the issue of it being a deterrent. So Matthew's saying they need to be made an example of. And if anybody is out there, if they're on Twitter or looking at grotesque YouTube videos and so on, and they feel the pull of maybe not the Caliphate anymore, but joining this group, if they see that the likes of Shamima Begum and they see that the likes of Huda Muthana have lost their citizenship, then perhaps they wouldn't go in the first place. Is that a valid argument?
Glamorizing violence is a problem, and that's something that we need to be very careful about. And I agree that such people who have gone to ISIS-held territory or any other foreign fighting territories or foreign fighting armies or non-army groups, combatants, we should make a very strong example of. The problem I'm seeing is that while we may have alternative solutions, for example, Shamima Begum was born in London. She is British. She went to school in Britain. She was radicalized in Britain. And she, unfortunately, traveled with her sister's passport, bypassing our intelligence and our passport control offices, and went to Syria. So the problem we have is that we need to look at our own house. And we need to, of course, make sure that we don't shift blame. Why would Bangladeshi government want to have Shamima Begum, who has never been to Bangladesh? We need to bring them back, and we need to put them on trial, and we need to give them very strong punishment that becomes a deterrent. And in the process, while they're in the prison, we need to find a way of rehabilitating. But we need to go one step further. And that step further is the contentious one. Anybody breaking the international law that we have should be punished, including people like Tony Blair for waging the war in Iraq in the first place. If Tony Blair can get away with murder and mayhem that he created in Iraq, and if the international community can get away with its silence when it came to the Syrian people, why should young people take anybody seriously? Because we are hypocrites. We say one thing, we do something else. It's okay to see the massacre of Muslims in Burma and do nothing about it. It's okay for Russia to obliterate people in Syria.
There's a bunch of things you're throwing at
it seems like
so let's
inconsistent, inconsistent policies is a problem.
Right. Okay, so
inconsistent solution is a problem. So consistency means I would like to see people punished for breaking the law everywhere.
Okay, so you threw a bunch of stuff there. Matthew Brodsky, when Ajmal mentioned Tony Blair, you had a bit of a grimace. Tell me why.
Well, I'm less inclined to take the approach that, these people, foreign fighters, would-be Islamists, are not responsible actors, that they had no part in this, that the world is happening to them, and that's the result is that they became ISIS fighters. That's not the case. They're responsible for their own actions. The fact is, if it wasn't Tony Blair, whatever war he wants to blame it on, then it's the states in which they live, which certain Sunni states appoint mosques, appoint the imams or preachers to mosques, and they preach certain ideology. This is a large standing problem, and the fact is it only gets solved when Islam itself wants to solve it, which makes the case, of course, that this is not Islamic, period. And as long as these fighters are going to be drawing on the Quran and going to be drawing on Hadith, are going to be drawing on Islamic jurisprudence to back up their actions, then it is a problem that Islam is going to have to solve. We can put the Band-Aid on it by, trying some cases here and a war here or there, but this problem only gets solved when Islam is going to solve it.
Ajmal?
I find that very, very shallow and very disingenuous on the part of Matthew. I'll give you an example. Let's take the example of Saudi Arabia. Who created Saudi Arabia? British did. Hold on. Matthew, I'll come to you in a second. Who created Saudi Arabia? British did. Why did they create Saudi Arabia? To further their own interest. Who did they instill as a ruler? The Al Saud family. Al Saud family stays in power by the help of Americans and Brits continuously, by buying weapons from us and by supplying us oil. Can the Saudi people free themselves of this tyranny? No. Egypt is the same. Bangladesh, Pakistan, most of Muslim countries are run by despots that we supported, we instilled, and then now we say, oh, hang on a second, our foreign policies that have been unethical, immoral and rotten have nothing and no consequences whatsoever. I agree with you, Matthew, that those fighters who have gone to fight, those who have picked up guns, those who are killing, murdering, they should be brought to justice. Absolutely. I live with 2 death threats from those nutters. I'm consistent about my call. I'm saying the root cause of the problem is our unethical foreign policies, and we need to put that right, and we need to bring to justice everybody who has broken the law and who have caused havoc in the world, including Tony Blair, George Bush, and the ISIS fighters.
Okay, I want to bring in Robin Simcox here because
let's just bear in mind that these countries were occupied maybe for 20 years or so. So this is blown out of proportion and is just a cheap line.
Okay, you guys disagree on the role of foreign policy.
Again.
Okay,
there aren't a lot of Kurdish ISIS fighters. There aren't a lot of Tibetan fighters. These have been occupied people from their perspective from a long period of time.
Okay, Matthew.
It's not the problem of the country there.
We're running out of time here. I want to bring in Robin Simcox because I want to ask about something on the ground in Iraq right now. So setting aside the issue of radical ideology and the role of Western foreign policy in Arab and Muslim countries, looking on the ground in a place like Iraq, fascinatingly, Hans-Jakob Schindler, former advisor to the UN Security Council on ISIS and other extremist groups, said recently, the same grievances that gave rise to ISIS in 2013 in Iraq remain today, including a large Sunni minority that's feeling politically, economically disenfranchised, marginalized by the Shia-led central government. We saw it in the past with Nouri al-Maliki's government, where a lot of people on the ground felt no opportunities. They turned to Daesh. They turned to extremism, setting aside all the foreign fighters and all of that, right? Is that the main thing that needs to be solved on the ground in a place like Iraq, Robin?
I don't know if it's the main thing, but it definitely goes in the mix. The problem of sectarian grievances, the Sunni Shia conflict that kind of arose, especially out of the post-2003 invasion and settlement, I think was a key driver in leading to ISIS's creation. I would just make one quick point on the foreign policy thing from the West point of view. You've got to remember the West didn't intervene in Bosnia, it didn't intervene in Syria, it didn't intervene in Myanmar, say, and it gets criticized very strongly. It intervened in Iraq, it intervened in Afghanistan, it intervened in Libya, it gets criticized very strongly. Ultimately, I think asking for consistency on this is a shallow hope. And we also have to say that no matter what the West does in its foreign policy, there's always going to be those who look to criticize it. And that's what, I mean, groups like Al-Qaeda and ISIS, they don't care about the morality, essentially, of Western foreign policy. They use it as a vehicle from which to recruit other followers.
Well, Daesh has lost its land, but it's still very much alive. And this is why this conversation is going to continue for a long time to come. Ajmal, Robin, and Matthew, I have to move on to another segment. I would have loved to have continued, but I look forward to having you back on the Newsmakers. Thanks so much for joining us. Still to come, Westminster rebels. We take a look at the British MPs who've quit their parties to form an independent group. What has it got to do with Brexit? And European and Arab leaders meet in Egypt to boost investment. Is the EU ignoring human rights abuses for financial gain? In the UK, 8 Labour MPs and 3 Conservatives have quit their parties to form a new centrist group. The lawmakers who started it say they lost confidence in their leader, Jeremy Corbyn, and his handling of alleged anti-Semitism in the Labour Party. They were soon joined by Tories who want the UK to remain in the EU. They accuse the government of allowing right-wing hardliners to shape the party's approach to Brexit. Prime Minister Theresa May says she was saddened by the resignations, but would still press on with her attempts to win a deal before Britain leaves the EU. The newly formed independent group has vowed to transform the UK's political system completely. Can it? Natalie Perhernan takes a look.
Politics is broken. Let's change it. It's a motto for the latest political movement in the UK, the Independent Group. It came to life after the resignation from their parties of 8 Labour lawmakers and 3 pro-EU Conservative MPs. A unifying issue for all of them is Brexit.
I'm furious that the Labour leadership is complicit in facilitating Brexit, which will cause great economic, social and political damage to our country.
But for some of the former Labour members, there are also issues that go beyond the UK's place in the EU.
I cannot remain in a party that I have today come to the sickening conclusion is institutionally anti-Semitic.
British politics is now well and truly broken. And in all conscience, we can no longer knock on doors and support a government led by Jeremy Corbyn or the team around him.
Labour leader Jeremy Corbyn has not announced any plans to change his leadership style, but he has told the remaining members of his party that Labour will back a second referendum on whether the UK should leave the EU if Labour's Brexit deal doesn't pass in Parliament this week.
Morning.
Are you backing the second
Good morning.
referendum?
Good morning.
Stop.
How nice to see you here today.
For your party.
Mind the way, please. My bad. Thank you. Apologies. Sorry, sir.
It could be a strategy that prevents more defections. All of the members of the independent group back a second referendum. But a 9th Labour MP, Ian Austin, resigned last week over what he calls a culture of anti-Semitism. Corbyn has faced ongoing criticism for his handling of accusations of anti-Semitism in the party.
Jeremy Corbyn!
When people, as I said, are racist towards each other, then we oppose it in any way whatsoever. If anyone is racist towards anyone else in our party, wrong, out of court, out of order, totally and absolutely unacceptable. Anti-Semitism is not acceptable in any form, in any way whatsoever, anywhere within our society.
A message that was delivered too late to stop this new political movement. Natalie Pohanen, The Newsmakers.
Well, joining me now from London is Chris Williamson. He's the Labour Party MP for Derby North. And in Chicago, we have the former Labour Party policy advisor, Azim Ibrahim. He's now a research professor at the US Army Strategic Studies Institute. Gentlemen, thank you very much for joining us here on The Newsmakers. Chris, let me start with you. So for many of these rebels, Jeremy Corbyn's Labour Party was too anti-Semitic, or it was too equivocal on Brexit, or both. Could they be right?
No, they're not. And these are 11 individuals who've never supported Jeremy Corbyn, never supported the new direction that the Labour Party's taken now since Jeremy became the leader. I think the truth is that Labour Party members, indeed the country as a whole, had become very tired and dissatisfied with the policy agenda that successive governments had pursued, both new Labour and indeed Conservative governments. Really what we've been living with is a sort of market economics, sort of neoliberal economic agenda ever since Margaret Thatcher was elected in 1979. And I think there was a real appetite for a change of direction. And the truth is now that the Labour Party's policy programme is supported by between 70 and 80% of the general public, whether that be public ownership or scrapping tuition fees, building council houses, having an economy that works in the interests of everybody, secure employment for people again, and making sure that our public services are fit for purpose. Regrettably, over the last 4 decades, we've seen public services used as a cash cow to generate profits for the private sector. And I just think people have had enough. And that's why it was such a breath of fresh air when Jeremy Corbyn was elected. And sadly, some MPs, these 8 who've left the Labour Party, were just never really comfortable with that different direction, and they've made an honourable decision, I guess, if they don't feel that they are in step with the Labour Party members or indeed the country as a whole. They've made the right decision in moving on.
Azim, is that a fair analysis of what's happened?
Well, it's very telling that this independent group has only been formed last week, and they're already polling at 18%. In comparison to the Labour Party's 23%. So they are actually within 5 points within Labour within 1 week. And this is an entity that is not a political party. It does not have a manifesto. It does not have any policies at all. And the fact that they're polling so well has significantly rattled the Labour Party, which is why they've called this people's vote within the last 24 hours. I don't accept Chris Williamson's analysis of Jeremy Corbyn being extremely popular. I think some of the individual policies of Labour are very popular within the public, but Jeremy Corbyn himself is polling at the lowest rate of any opposition leader ever.
But
at this stage.
So Azim, what we're hearing from Chris is that essentially these people who broke away were not Corbyn fans to begin with. It's not as if they were betrayed somewhere along the way. They never liked him from the beginning. They never wanted him. And they're not true Labour, in his opinion. They're more centrists, and so good riddance. That sounds roundabout accurate, isn't it?
It's not up to Chris to decide who is true Labour and who is not. Certainly, Jeremy Corbyn comes from a very different wing of the Labour Party, and these individuals were never comfortable with his leadership, as was the case with the majority of the parliamentarians. And I think what Jeremy Corbyn has done now in calling this people's vote is that he probably realised that the hemorrhaging MPs are very fast rate, and there's probably rumours of a significant number more that are willing to join, particularly as the independent group, as it's called, was gaining so much traction within the public domain.
Chris, the fact that Corbyn has called for a second referendum for the first time shows that these guys breaking away has had an impact. They've dragged Corbyn to make a decision. That's a fact, isn't it?
No, it's not really. And I think it's important as well not to reduce politics to personalities. It's not about Jeremy Corbyn. It's about the policy direction that the Labour Party has taken now. And as I've already said, they are very, very popular policies, and say overwhelmingly backed by the British people. As far as the decision that was taken,
I think that's Jeremy Corbyn calling you right now.
No,
carry on.
No, it's my constituents or something. But no. As far as the decision to consider a people's vote now, I mean, this was always on the cards. And indeed, when it was being rumoured that some people were considering leaving the party, I mean, people like the Shadow Chancellor John McDonnell and others were saying on the media, why are they leaving? I mean, what's the issue? I mean, we're very clear in terms of the policy that we adopted at the Labour Party conference. We said that we wanted to try to ensure that any deal met with the 6 tests that the Labour Party set based upon the commitments that were given by the Conservative government. And if that wasn't successful, to then try to secure a general election. And the very last step was to look at possibly calling for another referendum. So this was something that was agreed by the party last September at our conference. So, to suggest that somehow these 8 individuals who decided to move on because they're out of step with the British people and Labour Party members has somehow forced Jeremy Corbyn's hand is absurd.
OK, so Azim, the vast majority came from Labour. The genesis was in Labour and people being disgruntled over alleged anti-Semitism and other issues. But we've also got Tories joining them now. So when we look at it and we place it in the context of Theresa May's negotiations with the EU, all those votes that had happened in Parliament, has this contributed to the chaos, or is this healthy for UK democracy?
Well, the idea that this was on the cards in the Labour Party from the beginning is certainly not true. Jeremy Corbyn has been forced into this position by the breakaway members of Parliament, gaining considerable traction. The reality is that Jeremy Corbyn has been the most vociferous anti-European Labour MP that there was. He has voted against the European Union for the last 30 years. In fact, when the vote result came in, there was only 2 politicians in the UK that called for an immediate implementation of Article 50. That was Nigel Farage and Jeremy Corbyn. And he is on record in saying that the European Union is a Frankenstein project from which the UK will be much better off withdrawing. So he's been forced into this position because of these members of Parliament that are breaking off and gaining this kind of popularity amongst the public. Whether it's good for the public domain, for public politics in general, I always believe that debate and a wide variety of debate is always healthy for democracy. Jeremy Corbyn is an individual who these people could simply not see being Prime Minister. They believe that he was a threat to the national security of the United Kingdom, considering his past support of organisations and entities which they find alien to their own beliefs. So it's not just about anti-Semitism or Brexit, it is about Jeremy Corbyn himself. And as many of them said, they simply cannot go back to their own constituents and ask them to vote to put Jeremy Corbyn into Downing Street. This is something that they simply find completely untenable.
Well, that generated the question, Chris. How do your constituents feel? Do they see this breakaway as somehow weakening the party? Are they worried? Do they see it as a threat?
No, I mean, I think they're an irrelevance. And, don't read too much in these early opinion polls. I mean, let's remember when the Social Democratic Party was founded by much more significant figures than the lightweights that have left the Labour Party. I mean, they reached, I think, around 50% in the opinion polls, but they disappeared without trace at the next election. And that's basically this organisation, this so-called independent group's got a shelf life until the next election. And in relation to the European Union, I mean, yes, Jeremy's got his criticisms. I've got my criticisms. It's far from a perfect institution. And indeed, our campaign in the EU referendum was to remain and reform the European Union. And it's interesting that MPs described, not necessarily Jeremy's allies either, but they described him as having the energy of a 25-year-old in the referendum campaign. He addressed more meetings than any other politician and threw himself into that campaign and made a very honest pitch. And look, around 65%, I think it was, of Labour supporters actually supported remaining in the European Union. There's a sort of remain and reform agenda that Jeremy Corbyn and the Labour Party was putting forward. And, the enemies of Jeremy, of course, said, well, this was some catastrophic failure on his part. And yet Nicola Sturgeon, who's the leader of the Scottish National Party, achieved a similar percentage of the SNP supporters who voted Remain, and she was hailed as a hero. So, these arguments are bogus that they put forward about Jeremy Corbyn. He put forward an honest campaign in relation to the European Union. As I say, it was a sensible one. It was one that did resonate with people. It did turn a lot of people who were going to vote to leave in favour of voting Remain. But we are where we are now. And, as I've said, Jeremy is a very popular figure within the Labour Party. Labour's got more members now, I think, than any other political party in Western Europe. We're an incredibly great success story, thanks to Jeremy Corbyn. And, I think a lot of the grassroots members, if, a few malcontent MPs don't recognise that fact, the vast majority of Labour Party grassroots members do.
Azim?
Well, I agree with Chris, is that we simply do not know what the shelf life of this independent group will be. At the moment, they have no leader, they have no manifesto, they have no policies. And the reality is that the British electoral system of first past the post does not favour these kinds of new entities emerging. If we had a system of proportional representation, then certainly, they could have some kind of traction and turn that into some sort of results. But at the moment, we just do not know what to expect from them. It seems that it's more of an insurgency, and much of it will depend on how much more of other members of parliament from both the parties, the major parties that they will attract. Will they develop into an official political party? Will they make some sort of deal with some of the other parties like the Liberal Democrats or even possibly the SNP? There's so many unknowns at the moment that we just don't know which direction this may actually all go in.
Well, since the middle of 2016, UK politics has certainly not been boring, that's for sure. Chris and Azim, I've got to move on, but I thank you both for joining us here on The Newsmakers. Looking forward to having you back on the show.
I am sure you will all agree with me on the fact that this summit's success is not only measured by the great discussions held therein, but also by the extent to which this successful summit becomes a new milestone for the deepening of the historical relations between the European and Arab regions.
Leaders from the European Union and Arab League met in Egypt for their first ever joint summit. At the top of the agenda was migration, security, trade and investment. The EU wants closer ties with the Arab world, and Egypt needs money. The summit was held within a week of Egypt executing 9 suspected members of the Muslim Brotherhood. They were found guilty of assassinating prosecutor Hisham Barakat in 2015, but human rights groups say the men were convicted after being tortured into confessing. So, has the EU turned a blind eye to human rights abuses for the sake of financial gain? Well, to discuss this, I'm joined now from Doha by Marwan Kablan. He's the director of the policy analysis at the Arab Center for Research and Policy Studies. In Washington, D.C., we have Emily Hawthorne, who's the Middle East and North Africa analyst at Stratfor. And in Cairo, we have Mustafa Ragab. He's the director and founder of Egyptian Affairs UK. I thank you all for joining us here on the Newsmakers. Marwan, let me begin with you. We have the summit in Egypt. The questions are whether President Abdel Fattah Sisi has earned the right to be the statesman to host this type of summit with the EU.
Well, I think the summit has given Abdel Fattah Sisi what he actually was seeking from having it in Sharm el-Sheikh. That is the sort of legitimacy and the sort of recognition by the European countries that he is the legitimate leader of Egypt on the one hand, and he's the strong man that they can rely on in order to deal with the two key issues the Europeans are mainly concerned about. That is security, i.e. terrorism on one hand, and the prevention of the refugees from coming to Europe, because Europe actually is looking at the Middle East as a source of these two elements. On one hand, refugees, on the other hand, terrorism. So I think they are now investing actually in what they call strong leaders, strong leadership, which is for many people here in this region means tyranny and dictatorship, in order to prevent the influx of refugees into Europe on one hand, and also to try and prevent terrorism. But in my opinion, the Europeans who have been actually pursuing this policy for a long time, they are actually shooting themselves in the foot. Why? Because when you have tyranny, when you have dictatorship in the Middle East, and they should by now know that, you produce actually, or you actually have the sort of fertile ground in order to breed terrorism on one hand and export refugees to Europe. Understood. On the one hand. Okay. On the other hand. Okay. And the Syrian crisis actually was a very important demonstration of that.
Okay, Mustafa Ragab, we saw the tagline and the theme of the summit, investing in stability. Is that investing in stability at the expense of human rights, at the expense of democracy, at the expense of the rights of the people, in support of authoritarianism?
Of course not. I mean, this is just a personal attack on the president. This is always happening. I mean, we're using the cards of human rights and all these cards that he's using to just attack the progress that Egypt is doing at the moment. Egypt is going in the right way. There is criminals. There is a justice system that people go through the justice system, ended up with the Grand Imam to approve the justice system. So it's a long procedure before those criminals get prosecuted. We're not going to spend a fortune on them in prison to keep them in prison. If they are killers, they're going to be executed. As simple as that. Okay. And if people just say they're not, and they've been forced to say what they said, no, they have not been forced. There is a system that they go through to prove that they're guilty.
Okay, you're absolutely certain that they weren't tortured?
Have the Attorney General in Egypt been killed or not? He's been killed. Who killed him? Who planted all these bombs in the streets of Egypt? It is those criminals who got to be charged, who got to pay for what they done.
Okay, that's not answering my question, because it could still have been somebody else and the wrong people had confessed through torture and were executed. But let me move on here. Let me bring in Emily Hawthorne. Emily Hawthorne, from the European perspective, do they think along the lines of Mustafa Ragab that there's not too much bad going on within Egypt? Or are they looking at it geopolitically and thinking there's authoritarianism, but we need to strike a deal with Sisi because he's better than the rest of a very bad bunch out there?
I think it's really important to look at the context of what happened over the last 2 days in Sharm el-Sheikh. This was not just a meeting between EU leaders and Egypt. Yes, it was hosted in Egypt, but it was a meeting between Arab League members hosted by Egypt and a whole array of European leaders. There were 50 countries there altogether, and there were a lot of heads of state there, especially from the European side. The European side, as well as the Arab world, they both have economic interests, they both have security interests, and they both have strategic interests that they need the other side to cooperate on in order to be able to progress those interests. So the Europeans know that if they want to make progress on counter-terror initiatives in the region, if they want to try and work towards strategic interests like trying to counter growing Chinese influence in the region or growing Russian influence in the Middle East region, they need to be present. They need to be working with these governments. And I don't think it's that there is not a concern about human rights abuses in Egypt or in any other Arab country. But pragmatically and practically, you need to work with Sisi if you want to get anything done in the broader Mediterranean region. And I think that that's the sort of practical angle that you're seeing a lot of these European countries coming from, even though they are concerned about human rights abuses.
Okay, so Marwan, it's about something that's far bigger than Sisi and Egypt, the host. It's about being pragmatic and practical, and they both need each other. Do you accept that?
Chinese and Russian influence and pragmatism shouldn't be used as an excuse in order to condone authoritarianism in the Middle East. Most of the regimes right now in the Middle East are mainly tyrants, including of course President Sisi. There was no transparency about the execution of the 9 young men actually who were accused of killing the Attorney General in Egypt. We all know also that the judicial system in Egypt is not independent, so there is a big question mark about this. But I don't think the Europeans, they are not making themselves good actually by trading what they think security and the prevention of the influx of refugees from the south actually by giving this sort of recognition and legitimacy to the regimes in the south. I think the Europeans are making a big mistake because, as I said earlier, they are just postponing the big explosion in the region. We have seen that in 2011 and probably we are going to see it again, and Europe will be flooded with refugees if this big explosion is going to take place, and they are going to also suffer from terrorism because tyranny, the lack of democracy, is the breeding ground for terrorism and actually is the main source of refugees. So I think the Europeans, they must actually be wise. They must have, they must think for the future rather than having this very short-sighted strategy by thinking that by condoning these terrorists, actually they are protecting themselves from refugees and from terrorism. They must, in my opinion, promote democracy the way they did in Eastern Europe rather than promote and support tyranny in the Middle East.
Mustafa Ragab.
I think the Europeans have been very, very wise with this move. I mean, he's saying they should be wise. They are very wise by making this move because they need to work together now. The European need the Middle East, and the Middle East is led by Egypt. And Egypt is doing a lot of progress, and there is a recognition for the work that has been done in Egypt to have this conference there. This summit proves that Egypt is going in the right direction. If we're going to sing that song forever about human rights and democracy, forget about it. We need to build Egypt. We're not going to listen to those people
but do you accept
talking
that,
about
are you
human
admitting,
rights.
Mustafa?
Human rights is an issue.
Okay,
human
Mustafa,
rights is an issue all over the world. Don't talk about Egypt.
Are you admitting that you don't need to respect human rights and you don't need democracy to build Egypt?
No. Don't put words in my mouth.
I'm
human
asking
rights
you.
are respected, but it's a card that you play with all the time against Egypt. Human rights issue is all over the world. We respect that. But why Egypt? Why are you raising that card always in the face of the politics in Egypt? It's something that exists all over the world. We respect human rights, of course, we recognize human rights, but don't raise that card all the time in the face of the progress that Egypt is doing. Look at the economy
I assure
in Egypt.
you, Mr. Ragab.
Look at the tourism industry
Mr.
coming
Ragab,
back in Egypt.
Mr.
Look at the terrorism.
I can assure you.
Look at the terrorism and the success.
We don't do a travel
the rate
show.
of
This is not a
success
travel
that
program.
we're achieving in
Mr.
Egypt
Ragab.
in fighting terrorism.
Mr. Ragab, very clearly.
Terrorism did not succeed to
very
come
clearly and
inside
unequivocally,
Egypt.
this is not a tourism or travel program, right? And I assure you,
it is not. It's economic.
If 9 people were not executed and human rights, listen. Hold on for a second. If 9 people were not executed,
they will be executed. They committed a crime.
If Human Rights Watch said nothing about it, Mr. Ragab, if Human Rights Watch said nothing about it, if Amnesty International said nothing about it, we wouldn't bring it up, right? So you're saying we're trying to bring up human rights. I'm saying this is what the human rights organizations are talking about.
Listen,
and it's naive to say it doesn't happen in a political context.
Those human rights organizations, who fund them? Where do they get the fund from? Do you want to tell me that those human rights organizations are free to work? They're not directed by the people who funded them?
Who do you think funds them?
And they raise that card whenever it's needed.
Who do you think funds them?
Where do they get the fund from?
Who do you think funds them? Why do you think there's a conspiracy against Egypt?
The people behind the work, of course there is.
Okay.
People wanted Egypt to be like Iraq and Syria and Libya.
Okay.
But the people in Egypt and the army in Egypt will no way allow this to happen. Egypt is a country that's going to stand and is going to progress and going to go back to be a great Egypt because the plots and all the things that have been planned did not work, did not succeed.
Okay, it's very helpful.
China is not going to be the Islamic country, I'll tell you that.
So, let me bring in Marwan here. And I'll ask him the same question. They're meeting, they're talking.
Marwan just hates Egypt. Marwan
How
just
do you
hates
know that?
everything in Egypt.
How do you know
he
that?
He doesn't approve of anything. From his talk. All he's talking is about the terrorists,
I don't hate Egypt. I love Egypt. I wish
no, you
Egypt
don't love
to be
Egypt.
strong
You love
and
Egypt.
prosperous country.
You will never talk that bad about Egypt.
The way that is Egypt. No.
Where do you live, Mr. Marwan?
All
Where do you live?
Against in Egypt is the way actually. Regardless where I live, Mr. Najib, Egypt is like my country. I am an Arab. I love Egypt. I want Egypt to be a very strong and prosperous country. I want Egypt also to be a democratic country. I don't want Egypt to be ruled by this way. I don't wish Egypt any ill. I know Egypt is the leader of the Arab world.
If that's true, then you will not attack. If that is true, you will not attack Egypt in that way. If that is true, then you will help Egypt to progress.
No, I'm not attacking Egypt.
Something good to say about Egypt.
I'm not attacking
When was the last time you've been in Egypt?
I'm not attacking Egypt.
When was the last time you've been in Egypt?
I'm not attacking Egypt.
When was the last time
you've been in Egypt? The way Egypt
When
is
was the
Marwan.
last time you've been in Egypt?
Go ahead, Marwan.
Just a few years ago. Just a few years ago.
When was the last time you've been in Egypt?
He's answering you now. Let him finish.
I was in 2013.
In Egypt?
In 2013.
My goodness gracious. I'm talking to you from Egypt
I'm
now.
telling you, I was in Egypt 2013.
And I can see the progress. And I can see how Egypt is a safe country.
I understand, but you are saying that I hate Egypt. I do not hate.
Okay, listen, gentlemen. Marwan, I'm going to give you 20 seconds to wrap us up because we're out of time. So please, Mr. Regab, if you don't interrupt, I'd appreciate it. Marwan, finish up for us. 20 seconds, please, sir.
Well, actually, when Egypt is, as I said before, Egypt is a very important country. We would like actually this summit to have a place, to take place in Egypt. But what we are actually concerned about Egypt is this violation of human rights, the lack of transparency, the lack of independent judiciary in Egypt. We want Egypt to be the leader of the Arab world. Egypt cannot be the leader of the Arab world when it's ruled by this sort of leadership.
Okay. Mustafa Regab, Marwan Kablan, and earlier Emily Hawthorne, I thank you all for joining us.
We've had the best leadership so far, and we're going to progress despite whatever anybody says.
Okay, well, we hope so. We hope so. Mr. Regab, Mr. Kablan, and Ms. Hawthorne, thanks so much. And that's all for this edition of The Newsmakers with me, Imran Garta. Check out more of our stories on YouTube, Facebook, and Twitter. Remember to like, follow, and subscribe. Next time, Robert Mueller is expected to release his report this week about possible collusion between Russia and the White House. Could it lead to Donald Trump's impeachment? Until then, thank you for watching. Bye-bye.